encourage your soul, enlighten your mind, and empower your faith. This is the Light Network.
Welcome to Inside the Scholar Study, where we discuss all things concerning Scripture, faith, and scholarship. My name is Brad McNutt, if you're ready, we're going to go inside the Scholar Study. And we're going to talk today about someone we discussed a little bit last week, but to look at him a little bit more in depth, and that's Erasmus and the manuscripts that he used, and some of the maybe debacles he created, but doing the best he can where he is at that time. And
I think that's right. Yeah, he was. Erasmus. We talked about him last week. I'll just reintroduce listeners to him. He was for our purposes, this is what he did. Is he was the first guy to publish a printed Greek New Testament, 1516. And so that's really important because, the first is often, it definitely is the trendsetter. It's the seminal, but it also is sort of sets the stage for every subsequent one in terms of it becomes the authority. We've talked about this with printing before when we've talked about the printing press, but let's just bring the ideas over to the Greek New Testament as well, because printing was invented, 1450 or so, movable type and modern printing, the hand press. Johannes Gutenberg, the Latin Vulgate is what they were doing when they printed Bibles. It was the Latin Vulgate. I mentioned last time that also sometimes the Hebrew Bible was printed. And then Erasmus is the one who sort of pioneered this, the Greek New Testament in printed form. And, by virtue of the fact that it's the first one, well, before printing, you only have manuscripts, and manuscripts necessarily differ from one another in some places. There are no two manuscripts of anything that are exactly alike. And that is true of the Bible. However, and we raised these issues at the end of the last episode, but however you want to think about God overseeing the transmission of his word, and I definitely I don't have very precise, detailed thoughts just because I don't think we have the data for that. But I think that I do think about that, this sort of theological, God is overseeing, supervising. He certainly didn't do it in the way that he preserved every scribe from any error or anything like that, or from making any changes. We know for sure that he didn't do it that way because we have the evidence of the manuscripts, and they're all different, just in the exact same way that all manuscripts of every work are different in some ways. And we talked about this last time as well, but we can push forward a little bit more with it, that the differences among the manuscripts do sometimes make people uncomfortable, or they wish it weren't the case, or they wish God had done something different from what he ended up doing. But as far as I can tell, they don't sort of jeopardize our understanding of God's will for the world and for our lives and how we respond to him, his message of grace. When you actually look at the differences, and last time we looked at this difference in Revelation 22:19 about Book of Life versus Tree of Life. When you actually look at those differences, there are some that are much more substantial and bigger than that, but still doesn't seem like it's jeopardizing our understanding of God's will for us. And it's not the kind of thing that's this reading of Revelation 22:19 says you shouldn't change the Bible, and this reading of Revelation 22:19 says you should. Or, it's nothing along those lines. It's not mutually contradictory. And often that is the case. There probably are variants that are mutually contradictory, but usually they're super easy to solve, those variants. There are much fewer that are really harder to solve. And the ones that are harder to solve usually do not involve things that are all that, I don't know, important is probably the wrong word, but, urgent. So you just have to, when you study this issue, I think you come to see that it's not as big of a deal as people on both sides tend to make it, or at least that's the way I perceive it. I recently, Brad, I don't know what, I guess you consider yourself a millennial, but I
Yeah, I think
recently,
that.
um, when I was giving a chapel speech and trying to like calm people down. Well, it was about politics. I gave a chapel speech about politics, and I said, we just need things. We're Christians. We know God is in control. We shouldn't think about these things as like existential threats. And somebody said, well, you would say that because you're Gen X. So I don't know if that, how much that has determined like my approach to every issue, that things are not that big of a deal, but
I
maybe
wonder
it
if that
has.
individual has ever read C.S. Lewis about chronological snobbery.
Yes,
Um,
right. Yeah,
or,
right.
well, yeah,
Yeah.
just, yeah, a number of things, thoughts there. I'll just leave them.
Yeah. All right. So Erasmus, he printed the Greek New Testament. You were saying earlier, Brad, he did the best he could, and I think that's. I mean, definitely, Erasmus in his own lifetime was considered the best scholar in Europe, and nobody could have done better. Um, he I mean, maybe he thought he was offering like the definitive version of the Greek New Testament for all time, but if you think for a second, I mean, that that's just not going to happen. And there's always going to be discoveries that are made and updates that are going to be made and reinterpretations of evidence. So he is at least, I think, a sympathetic view of Erasmus here is that he is at least launching us into this field, getting us started, and then
And
subsequent people can make revisions to improve the text that he offered us.
that's what I hear some people sometimes they will cite scholars who are much older and will say maybe from different centuries or something different, even generations. Well, this individual said this, yes, but if that individual had the same data that we have, I can almost guarantee you they would come to the same conclusion. Like they're operating in an era where they only have a certain amount of data. There could have been a mountain hill of discovery since then that would have, they followed the evidence where it took them as they had it. And I'm convinced that they would have followed it to the next logical conclusion where people take it. And that's the way I think about it. Knowledge is something like we build up, we build up, we build up, and you grow it, and it, it progresses. It's not a war about, well, I was right in the 1700s. It's right for all time. I think it's more of we're working together in the
Right. Yeah.
process.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's good. That's a good way to think about it. So Erasmus, he had to get manuscripts, of course. He's going to print the Greek New Testament. Um, so he needs to know what to print. He needs to know what words to put on the page, and in order to do that, he's got to get manuscripts of the Greek New Testament so that the type can be set and he can. Oh, I was about to make this point. I don't know, 5 minutes ago, and I think I
Mm.
never got there. That the when I was talking about the manuscripts necessarily differ from one another, but that's the revolution of print, is that you can have two copies of the exact same work that say the exact same thing. And so for the Greek New Testament, the first time that happens is with Erasmus, where he can print, and I don't know how many copies was that first print run of his Greek New Testament, but let's say a few hundred copies. Well, more or less, all of those copies are going to say the exact same thing. So think about that. If you've got, let's say you have 1,000 copies. Now you have all these manuscripts of the Greek New Testament that all differ from each other in some ways. And then you have 1,000 printed copies of the Greek New Testament that all say the exact same thing. Well, of course, that becomes the standard text because you can sort of rely on it. You can say, well, your copy and my copy are the exact, we don't have to check it. We know that they're the exact same. So then it becomes this, you attribute more authority to it than it really deserves. But it's because everybody now has the same. Now, let me just put in another caveat. I feel like I'm always putting in caveats, but this is inside the scholar study. So it's like, that's what we do. We have to provide nuance to things. It's not actually true that when you print something, especially in Erasmus's day in 1516, that when you print something, all the copies are going to be the same, because you can change the type in the middle of the printing. If you notice, oh, I left out a letter, you can go in and add that. If you left out punctuation mark, you can go in and during the print run, so maybe you print 100 sheets and then you notice something, you're checking the sheets and, oh, I left out this word or whatever. Now, usually they're going to be pretty small changes in that way, but I just want to throw that in there that even if you have 2 copies of the first print run of something, they might have little differences. Usually that's not going to be the case in the modern, like 21st century, but in the 16th century, that would happen. All right.
According to Houston Christian University, their website says that there were 3,000 copies were originally printed of his first 2 editions of the New Testament.
Oh, okay. All right. Very good. Houston Christian University says this.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right, so he needs to know what to print. So he needs Greek manuscripts. So I mentioned this a little bit last time that he had just a few. I have written down here in my notes 8. He had 8 manuscripts that he's using. Now, remember, we've talked about this before. How many did we say? 5,300 manuscripts of the New Testament we now have. Of course, a lot of those are little scraps, but 5,300. Erasmus had 8. Let me read them off to you. And you can go to the INTF website yourself and get on that lista and look them up and get information about all these. Codex 1 is what it's called. It contains every New Testament book except Revelation. Okay, and it's from the 12th century. Codex 2. So these numbers are the INTF website numbers. Okay, that's what they are. Codex 2 is from the 11th or 12th century, and it contains the 4 Gospels. Codex 2815, 12th century, contains Acts and the Epistles. Codex 2814, 12th century. This is the copy of Revelation. We'll see a picture of it here in just a minute, but this is Revelation with the commentary of Andrew of Caesarea. So the 2814 from the 12th century is the one copy of the book of Revelation that Erasmus has for his 1516 edition. Codex 2816 from the 15th century contains Acts and the epistles. Okay, so what that's so far 2 copies of Acts, 2 copies of the epistles. He's got 3 copies of Acts, 3 copies of the epistles, because one of the manuscripts has all of it except for Revelation. He's got 2 copies of the Gospels so far. Let's see what the next one is. 2817 from the 11th century, and it contains the Pauline epistles. So that's what, the 4th copy, I think, of Paul's letters, with commentary of somebody called Pseudo Ecumenius. And then number 7, the Codex 817 from the 15th century, and it contains the Gospels with a commentary of Theophylact. And finally, Codex 2105 from the 12th century, and it contains the Pauline epistles with the commentary of Theophylact. I've got this in my notes. This last manuscript, 2105, copy of the Pauline epistles with the commentary. The commentary is easily confused with the New Testament text. And according to a scholar named Andrew Brown, he says, although Codex 2105 is now in Oxford, it belonged to the library of the Basel Dominicans during the period when Erasmus was preparing and publishing his series of New Testament editions. So it was there in Basel. That's the city, Basel, Switzerland, where Erasmus printed, or Froben is the guy that ran the printing house. Erasmus was the scholar. Froben did the printing, and it was there in Basel where that took place.
That's what's, and you may have mentioned this. I just spaced for a second. So how extensive was his search? Obviously, he's only dealing with 8 manuscripts, as you said. So is he like going to a monastery, a church?
Let's see. Let me just read to you what I've got written in my notes here. Well, before I do that, I'll say this. I think Erasmus had encountered other manuscripts before at previous points in his life, and he had done some studying of Greek manuscripts. And of course, he's a Latin scholar, and he's intimately familiar with the Vulgate, and so that is the main, like sort of the main part of his study of the Bible is the Latin Bible. But he's learned Greek. He's also encountered their manuscripts. But at the time that he was actually printing, what he had access to was 8. Where did these 8 come from? Let's see. Erasmus arrived in Basel without a manuscript. I'm just reading from my notes here. He could not find a single manuscript containing the entire New Testament, which are very rare. By the way, I think I said something wrong in a previous episode. I mean, I'm sure I've said several things, but I didn't catch it. But about the number of manuscripts that contain the entire New Testament, I think there are 61. I'm getting that from David Parker's book called, let me get it. An Introduction to New Testament Manuscripts and Their Texts. He says there are 61 manuscripts that contain the entire New Testament. As far as in Greek, Greek New Testament manuscripts. As far as manuscripts that contain the entire Greek Bible, there are only about 7 or something like that. Okay, so Erasmus couldn't find a manuscript that had the entire Greek New Testament. John of Ragusa in Sicily had been in Constantinople about 100 years earlier, 1435. Then he went to the Council of Basel. There was a Catholic council held in Basel sometime in the 15th century, taking his newly acquired Greek biblical manuscripts. So this guy, John of Ragusa, had been in Constantinople, which is the headquarters of the Byzantine Empire. That is where they do Greek. They speak Greek there. They've got Greek manuscripts. So he had been there. He took these manuscripts to Basel, to a council, a Roman Catholic council, which is also, that's where Erasmus was going to eventually print the Greek New Testament. He took his Greek biblical manuscripts with him, this John of Ragusa. Upon his death in 1443, the manuscripts became the property of the convent of the Dominicans in Basel. Erasmus borrowed the following manuscripts from the Dominican friars of Basel. And then, well, let's see. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. He borrowed all of them, it seems like, except for 2815. 2815 was, let's see, that is a 12th century manuscript containing Acts and the epistles. That was borrowed from the Amerbach family. Now, I think Erasmus himself did not necessarily directly borrow them from the Dominicans of Basel, but or is Johann Reuchlin a Dominican? He borrowed them from this guy named Johann Reuchlin, who might be a Dominican. Let me look him up. German. Yeah, he was a Dominican. Okay, but he was the
What is meant
um,
by the name Dominican? What is that?
a type of monk.
Okay.
Yeah, like there's Franciscan monks, Dominican monks. So there's this monastery in Basel. So I guess Johann Reuchlin was a part of that monastery, and he was a great scholar. Johann Reuchlin, who is most famous in my mind, at least, for his Hebrew studies. He wrote like the first Hebrew grammar by a Christian scholar in Europe in that this same time period. Um, but he had some of these manuscripts, and Erasmus borrowed them. So that's where they're coming from, these manuscripts. Did he do a big search? I don't think so. I mean, I think he had encountered manuscripts before, and then when he was in Basel, he used what was available to him in Basel. All right, so let me share my screen, and we can see some more pictures
We
for
think we
those
have
who
the
are.
screen sharing figured out this time.
How'd that go for you?
There we go.
You got it. All
It's
right.
there.
So here's Erasmus again, and this is just sorry for people who are listening, but you can get some impression if you're not on YouTube or watching it. This is at the Museum of the Bible in Washington D.C.
Mm.
That's a picture of me, obviously, next to a first edition of Erasmus's Greek New Testament, 1516. I can. That's a little closer,
Is it underneath
and
glass? Because
yes, yeah,
okay.
there
At
is.
first
Yeah,
I
you can't
thought
actually touch it.
wow, that's
Oh,
bold.
yes, right. Yeah, yeah, you can't. And you can see when you zoom up a little bit, so it's open to the beginning of the Gospel of John. That again,
Mm.
Erasmus's Greek New Testament. It was a 2-column thing. You've got Greek on the left, Latin on the right. According to scholars who really study Erasmus and his project here, it was the Latin that was most interesting to Erasmus. Like that was the point of the edition, was the
Mm.
Latin, not so much the Greek. They say that so you have the Vulgate that is the main Bible of Western Europe at this time, and Erasmus wanted to improve it. He wanted a better Latin Bible, and so he offered his own translation. So what is printed here in Latin is not the Vulgate; it's Erasmus's translation. And he printed the Greek so that people could check him, so that it sort of provided the basis for, you can see why I'm translating this way, sort of a justification. So the main point of this edition was not actually the Greek New Testament, but was the Latin Bible. But of course, it was the Greek New Testament that was sort of seminal, original, and has come to be remembered. Right. And I mentioned I can't really tell what that picture is because it's too far away. I think this one down here is the Complutensian polyglot.
Mm.
Now, I mentioned last time the Complutensian polyglot, which is named Complutensian because it was from a city called Complutum in Spain. This was a Roman Catholic project. I mean, everybody was Roman Catholic at the time, or Greek Orthodox, but it's right around the time of the Protestant Reformation. So 1517 Protestant Reformation. This was right during that time. The Complutensian polyglot, it's Complutum is the city, polyglot, many languages. So it's printed in Hebrew, Latin, and Greek. And so it's a big thing, the Complutensian Polyglot, and it takes years to print. It's in 6 volumes. Um, and you can, well, once upon a time, you could find a copy of the Complutensian Polyglot on the British Library website. I don't know if you know, Brad, but maybe October, about a year ago, I think, October of 2023, I think there was a cyber attack on the British Library website, and it all shut down.
Mm.
And they're slowly getting it back up. But once upon a time, I ripped this picture off of the British Library website. They have a copy of the Complutensian Polyglot. So you can see what it looks like with the Latin in the middle, the Greek on one side, the Hebrew on the other. This is the Old Testament, of course. In the New Testament, it is just Latin and Greek, similar to Erasmus's then. I mentioned last time also that the Complutensian Polyglot is actually the one that was printed first. The Greek New Testament was printed in 1514. It just wasn't published until about 1522. The New Testament portion, which is all in one volume of the Complutensian Polyglot, of that 6-volume work, was the first one they printed. So then they had to do the entire Old Testament, and that took some time.
And maybe this is a different translation I'm thinking about, but wasn't there some like red tape with the Catholic Church or something that kind of held it back a little?
Like, especially back in the day, I think you still have to do this if you're printing a book that's supposed to have like the official seal of the Catholic Church, but you've got to get the imprimatur, the sort of like let it be printed, the stamp of approval from the Catholic hierarchy, whoever, some archbishop or something. So it took them some time. I think they got the imprimatur in 1520, I believe, from the Pope. There was a cardinal that was in charge of the project, Spanish Cardinal Jimenez, that was in, but he died, unfortunately, in 1517, which was right at the time that they were done with everything. They were done printing it in 1517, and just right around that time, he died that same year. And he was in charge of the whole project, and so when he died, there wasn't anybody really in charge. And so a few years later, somebody's like, well, we got all this printing done. Let's get the Pope's approval and get this thing done. So finally in 1520, they got the imprimatur. And then still I don't know exactly why, but they drug their feet. And then in 1522, I think is when they actually shipped copies out and published the thing. So yeah, it did take some time. Oh, well, I recently read a little bit about it, that I think part of the problem was Erasmus had already printed the Greek New Testament, which was not that big of a deal. Well, it was a big deal just because there was less demand for a copy of a printed Greek New Testament, because there was already, by the time they finally published it in 1522, there was Erasmus released his 3rd edition of his Greek New Testament in that same year, 1522. Plus there was already, we talked about this, the Aldine edition that was 1518. There's already Greek New Testaments out there. There's just less demand for this big behemoth of a book now. So I think that there was less urgency about the thing by the time it actually happened. Last time I tried to show this, but now we can. So this is Erasmus's. This is the end that you can see, Book of Life in Revelation 22:19 in Greek, Book of Life in Latin. The Aldine Greek Bible in 1518 also has Book of Life. I mentioned last time that's because they're just copying off of Erasmus. So it's not an independent testimony. But then we can see the Complutensian Polyglot. In Latin, they have Libro Vitae, Book of Life. But in Greek, they have Xulutes Zoes, Tree of Life. So their Greek New Testament actually does not match their Latin. In this situation, it seems like they printed the Latin from Latin manuscripts, and they printed the Greek from Greek manuscripts. They had a Greek manuscript that had the reading, that had the end of Revelation, unlike Erasmus. So they had one that had Tree of Life. So this is actually what we're looking at right now is actually the Complutense and Polyglot is the earliest printed Greek New Testament, and it has the reading Tree of Life. It just wasn't published until after Erasmus's. And here is a picture of the manuscript, manuscript 2814, the one manuscript of Revelation that Erasmus had. Let me see, and so the very last line at the bottom. I don't know if you can see that. It the very last line has. I'll translate the Greek here. I am the root and the genos, the family of David. And it goes right there, and then the commentary starts. And then I think if you flip the page, it's more commentary, and then it just comes to an end. And so these days, of course, we don't rely on Erasmus anymore. If you want the text of Revelation, you can get the hand editions of the Greek text of Revelation. You can get the Nestle Aland text, or you can get the UBS text. We've talked about those two hand editions of the Greek New Testament. But just this year, 2024, they published the ECM, the Editio Critica Maior of Revelation. And so if you're watching on YouTube, you can see the picture in our library. This is at Heritage Christian University. We've got this copy, and it's 4 volumes just on Revelation. And so one volume, I forget exactly how this goes. This volume has the text, and then the other volumes, it's supplementary material. If we can see the titles of it, I don't know that I can see what exactly they have in them, and I forget. But one volume has the text, and the other 3 are supplementary material. And if you look up the text, Revelation 22:19, this is what the page looks like of the ECM. And again, the point of the ECM is to give sort of a comprehensive view of the manuscript testimony from the first 1,000 years up until the year 1000. All right. In this case, of course, there are no manuscripts before the year 1000 that have the reading book. They all contain the reading tree. So they go beyond the year 1000 to give the evidence. We'll zoom in here in a second. So this is what that top line looks like. So again, like the top lines up here are the lines that contain the actual text of Revelation. And this is the apparatus. At the bottom of the page is the apparatus. So if we go to the top lines, we see his part from the tree of life. And then underneath that, we've got a few readings. We've got the reading book. We've got the reading part of the book. That's what it says, part of the book. We've got the reading tree. We've got another book here. And then if we go to the apparatus, we can see all those readings. So tree, we've got some stuff here. Reading B, book, manuscript 61, a correction of manuscript 61, and then manuscript 2067, a correction. These are the 2 manuscripts we talked about last time. 2067 is the manuscript that has it written in the margin. Not in the main text, but in the margin. It's a 15th century manuscript, but it doesn't have it in the original text. It's in the margin, and so it's possibly copied from Erasmus or something like that, the reading book. But manuscript 61 is a 16th century manuscript, and what it ends up having is, what it has in the text is part of the book, and then you can see, well, if you can't read Greek, I'm not sure that you'll see what I'm talking about, but it's what it says in the manuscript is part of the book, and then the word part is like scribbled through. So they have marked it out. So it just says the book. At any rate, it is the one manuscript that perhaps before Erasmus contains the reading book. So there's just not much there.
What does
But
the V
yeah,
stand for next to the 61? Is
yeah,
that a
the
V?
the V is videtur, which is a Latin word. It means it seems.
Okay.
So in other words, because I think it's because they scribbled through the
Right.
merus, and so it's like it looks like it said merus there
Okay.
originally part, but it scribbled through, so it's hard to tell. Um, so and then the star by 61 means this is the original text, whereas the C by 61 means this is the correction. And
And in what
you can,
sense is there a correction? Uh,
well, it's the scribble through thing.
okay. Okay.
So like the original text, it seems, had the word merus in their part, but
Mm,
then it was scribbled through, so the correction is without the word
I
part.
see. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Um,
I should know
okay. So
this. I've only sat through your class before on this, but I
yeah,
forgot for the moment. So,
yeah, no problem. Um, okay. So is that all I want? Oh, okay. 2067. This is the one that has yeah. Can you see this, Brad? That you see the word? Look, it's actually this is the manuscript that has it in the margin. This is that
mm-hmm.
15th century manuscript, and you can see. I think
Yep.
that's the word xulu there,
Yep.
and then you can actually see the word biblion or
Mm-hmm.
bibliu in the margin. It was written there. So, and this is freely available on the Vatican website, by the way. I guess you can see this. So there it is, this manuscript on the Vatican website. You can go to it and look at it. And it is, you want to go to 84R if you're looking for the actual page for that. Let me see, is that all I've got? Oh, there's a zoom in of it, and that's it. All right, so I'll just go ahead and stop sharing there. But that gives us a little bit more detail about Erasmus and about that. We can see the actual pictures of that reading about Book of Life and his context, how it came about that he got that, and that particular reading actually does disagree with the Complutensian Polyglot, which was the other major edition around that time that used different set of manuscripts.
Right. It's he's an interesting guy, and
Yeah.
you know, I don't know. I find it extremely interesting looking at all these types of things, different Bibles, how they, how do you get what you get? Things that
Yeah. Yeah.
things
Right.
that we have now, they don't magically appear. There has always been a process, and I'm not skeptical, but fascinated by the process that
Hmm.
gets us, whether it's manuscripts or a book, or if it's just even the evolution of thought on something. How did we get to where we
Yeah.
are? Sometimes bringing up where we started at the beginning, chronological snobbery, we can think we were the first people to ever come up with this notion. And if you just start peeking behind the curtain a little bit, you'll start to see there's a long line of people there and a long line of thoughts and influencers that kind of led us down this direction. And so I think it's helpful, and it creates an environment where, I mean, we were talking about the multitude of manuscripts and how God chose to preserve them that way. I had a teacher in my early schooling who made the argument that that may have been God's providential way of preserving the integrity of the text. That there were so many manuscripts scattered across so many places, so that, say you only had a handful of manuscripts and they were under the charge of one group, who's to know whether they changed them or they didn't?
Mm.
Whereas the multitude of copies from all over the places, it's kind of like a variety. So the witness of it is preserved in its integrity in
Yeah.
that way. So some of
Yeah,
these
I mean
things,
that's good. I mean there have definitely been accusations of changing the manuscripts for, I mean, forever. I mean, I can think of such accusations back in like the patristic era,
mm,
300, 400. But certainly like during the time of the Complutensian Polyglot, you know, the I don't remember if I've mentioned this before, but the Old Testament, I do know I've mentioned this, that the Old Testament of the Complutensian Polyglot had the Vulgate in the middle between the Hebrew and the Greek, the Septuagint on either side of it. And the editor, I mentioned this guy, Cardinal Jimenez, this Spanish cardinal, and he wrote in the preface that the Vulgate is in the middle. Of course, he himself is a proponent of the Vulgate, the Latin Vulgate. That's the Bible, because we're in Western Europe. And he said the Vulgate is in the middle, between the Hebrew and the Greek, just like Jesus on Calvary between the two thieves, because the idea is that the Jews corrupt their text. They like intentionally pervert the word of God. And so do those dirty Greeks, the Greek Orthodox.
Yeah.
They have corrupt manuscripts. And so the pure, unadulterated text of the word of God is the Latin Vulgate right in the middle there. And so you definitely have these ideas of corruption,
Yeah, without bias.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And it just so happens like everybody corrupts their Bibles except for us.
Exactly.
And it just so happens to be that the one Bible that is right is the Bible that we have always used.
Exactly.
Well, that's nice for you.
Yeah. It's nice to see some things never change either. So
yeah, that's right.
All right. Anything else we want to add today about Erasmus, his manuscripts?
No, I don't guess so.
All
Well,
right.
I mean, let me point out just again those few manuscripts, and I think all of them were certainly post the year 1000, right? Those 8 manuscripts that he had, all of them were after the year 1000. All of them were from basically the 11th century and later, and most of them were 12th, 15th century. And so he did know about a manuscript. He knew that it existed, a manuscript that we have not yet talked in detail about, but it is maybe the most famous manuscript of the New Testament, and it is called Codex Vaticanus. And he knew that it was there, and he knew that it was old, but he did not think it was a very good manuscript. He had never himself actually seen it. He had just heard about it, that it was in the Vatican Library. Somebody had written him a letter about it. One of the who worked at the Vatican Library, I think, had written him a letter about this manuscript. So he knew about it, but he didn't put a whole lot of stock in it. And he had never seen it, but all of his manuscripts that he actually did use were all pretty late. And he just didn't have access to earlier manuscripts. And it wasn't until after the time of Erasmus that these great manuscripts discoveries were made of the majuscules from earlier, and then the papyri from earlier even than that. So he was certainly doing the best with what he had, but we have a lot more now.
Yep. And just the ability to share information through the internet. I mean, pictures, all kinds of stuff that most of us would have never in our lifetime have even heard of them, much less be able to see them, access them, look at them ourselves. And so it is one of the blessings of an information age.
Yeah. Obviously there's all too much information. I mean, it's just hard to process it all. Of course, that's the value of computers, which I understand very little, but they can process it. And that's one of the directions textual criticism is going these days, or has been going, to process all that information that is now available.
All right. It will feel like you're drinking from a fire hydrant at times, but
yeah,
it is fun to be able to do. We want to remind you that episodes of this podcast are released each and every Wednesday. You can find them on our website at thelightnetwork.tv. Social media platforms will alert you to their releases, of course, and podcasting. Your favorite podcasting app, whatever that may be, you can go and like, subscribe, follow the show, and it will send them to you as they're released. Of course, we're available in YouTube as well with video this particular season, and something that we will continue on. We want to remind you, you can email us at scholars@thelightnetwork.tv, and We have enjoyed the interaction we've been able to have and look forward to more in the future. And we're grateful that you were with us today and hope that you'll continue to be with us as we move throughout this study of textual criticism.